Welcome to the second morning event of the Spring 2018 Common Read. The Common Read is sponsored by the English Department, the Southeastern Writing Center, and the Student Government Association. I'm David Hanson, head of the English Department. A special welcome to our Common Read author, Tracy K. Smith, who's here to talk to you about our Common Read text, Life on Mars. Before I introduce Tracy Smith, let me remind you of a few things. Here in Vonnie Borden tonight at 6:30, there will be another reading as well as a Q&A with Tracy, and there will be a reception and a book signing afterwards. I want to extend a special welcome to our dual enrollment classes who are here to join us either by live stream or here in the auditorium. We have Northlake Christian, Dutchtown, Franklinton, Ponchatoula, Falls River, St. Charles Catholic, Binsford, Bowling Green, St. Thomas Aquinas, and Bonneville. And our on-campus students as well. A welcome to our faculty and students. A special welcome to our reigning Louisiana Poet Laureate, Jack Bedell. So this is a banner year in which we welcome not only the U.S. Poet Laureate, but also our state Poet Laureate. Thank you to the Southeastern Channel for taping these events. Sign-up sheets will be available in the lobby afterwards. Be sure to turn off your cell phones, please. And we're going to ask you, as you have questions, we have microphones in the middle aisle up here, in the middle aisle up here. And so in order that everybody can hear the question and also so that the TV audience can hear the question as well, we're going to ask you to go to the microphone with your question. As questions begin, if you could go to the side aisles and line up so you're not blocking view, and then the ushers, Dr. Landrum and Ms. Chapman, will direct you to the microphone. Tracy K. Smith is Professor of Humanities and Director of the Creative Writing Program at Princeton University. As you know, if you read her memoir about growing up in California, she attended Harvard for an undergraduate degree where she earned a BA in English and Afro-American Studies. She then earned an MFA from Columbia University. That memoir, Ordinary Light, was finalist for the National Book Award in Nonfiction. In our Common Read text, Life on Mars won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry in 2012. She's the author of the poetry collections Duende and The Body's Question, and forthcoming soon is the collection Wade in the Water. In June 2007, Tracy Smith was named the nation's Poet Laureate, and in that same month, our Common Read Committee said, well, I guess we better invite her to Southeastern then. And she said yes. Tracy K. Smith.
Okay, good morning. I thought maybe I would talk to you a little bit about why I write poems, what the writing of poems, and I guess also the reading of poems helps or allows me to do, and then talk a little bit about what, from, I guess, the position of retrospect, I think Life on Mars is up to, what I think that book is looking for or at. I feel that the one feeling that drives me to the page as a writer is curiosity, and maybe second to that is anxiety. I write poems because they allow me to ask questions and take the time of moving through all the stages of, wondering, all of the fruitful, like gestures of thinking and associating and allowing an idea to unfold in a way that feels useful, and all of the fruitless parts of wondering as well, false starts, easy assertions that kind of break down and reveal themselves to be wrong or empty. I feel like going through this process of, feeling like there's success and like there are some things that fail strengthens my sense of what I feel, sometimes what I believe. And while I don't think any poem I've written answers the question that it asks, it allows for a path through wondering or into wondering that feels exciting. And why is that? I think it has to do with the fact that poems allow you to think in ways that are not linear and that are certainly not literal. They urge you to be resourceful and to associate quickly, to imagine that this feeling that lives in one context might gain something from turning to other and sometimes unlikely contexts for ideas, for feelings, for information, for possibility. So a poem is a way of like gathering or harvesting so many different feelings, notions, memories, and associations, and questions, and seeing what they have to say to each other. A poem fosters a conversation between many disparate things. And I think poems also put us into a position of feeling like we are in immediate contact with the material that we're exploring. And they do that through, a vivid and active use of language. Poems build scenes that you feel like you are able to move through. I always kind of touch my arms because it seems like poems create a sense of physical contact with the feelings, events, places, people that are being considered. And, they do that through language that invokes a sense of, like contact, of intimacy. It's a journey that you can take, in other words, that's pretty cheap and that is repeatable and malleable. I love the idea that I can sit down and write myself into proximity with other places, other real lives, other kinds of experience, and even with versions of the possible that come from my imagination. I invest in that activity because I feel like it makes me smarter, kinder, more patient, and broad-minded, more interested in other people's feelings and perspectives. And I think that ultimately enlarges me. I know that when I read poems by other poets that draw me into these other positions, I feel better. I feel enlarged. I feel smarter and abler to live in the world and offer something. I think Life on Mars started out as a book that I had to find a conceit in order to ask the questions that I keep asking. I think in every single one of my books, the predominant question is some version of, what do we do to each other? What do I do to you? What do I do to the people in my life? What does the nation I belong to do to other people in and outside of its borders? And why? And what is the fallout? What are the feelings that result from that? So I have to find different ways of asking that question so I can come up with different possible ideas or, maybe answers or theories. And as someone mentioned earlier, there was one poem that got pulled out of my second book because it didn't fit in with the cosmology of poems in it, and that poem was sci-fi. And when I was ready to start working on a new project, I said, what would happen if I use the lens or the motif of science fiction to ask these questions. If I look at my private experience with other people through the lens of science fiction, which creates an artificial kind of distance and allows me to see things as they might kind of as though I could extrapolate upon them. I can get an exaggerated or outsized sense of what is going on. And then my father became ill, and the sense of the future changed, because I was now living in a future where something I didn't believe could happen had happened. My sense of space, which was an imaginary setting in a lot of the poems like Museum of Obsolescence or Sci-Fi, that suddenly felt useful because it was this dark, distant, but present thing that I could imagine the afterlife being easily a part of. And so then the poems gathered a kind of urgency or momentum. But I also think that the book is not just about me thinking about us humans in terms of the future. I think the first section of the book really is kind of anchored to this sense, this dystopian sense of the future, this sense of progress and what we might lose in churning forward. And then the book moves into another stance. The second section, as I see it, is about being a daughter, being someone who has lost a loved one, so like almost being a survivor. The third section, I think, is really rooted in questions about America and what America's presence on the globe does. And I think the final section of the book is about being a woman, about being, a mother. It culminates in a poem or a couple of poems that are thinking about becoming a mother, poems that are thinking about love from a woman's perspective. And so I liked, the poems were not written in that order, but after I wrote them and made a big mess in my living room trying to figure out how to make a book out of them, I thought it might be interesting to start from the unfathomably large and mysterious and move to something that seems so local, domestic, and to hear the echoes of these other scales within, an apartment in New York City. So maybe, I don't know, maybe I'll read you a couple of poems from the later sections in the book, and then I'm really eager to talk with you about your questions and further observations that you have. The title poem is, I think, kind of funny because it's all about Earth, right? It's all about news stories that have kind of startled me. And so there was a moment when I was working on that poem, I knew it wasn't done, and I said, oh, what do I do next? It's a long poem written in sections, as you probably remember, and I got to what would be the 8th section, and I said, why am I doing this? What is this about? And I said, well, I'm thinking about Earth. I'm afraid of what it means to be alive in the 21st century, and so this is the section that came out of that. And you'll hear that these statements that are made because they're true gather force because of repetition and momentum, and that's what guided me through. It was sound that helped me sort of seal off that section and understand, what was at the heart of this meditation. The earth beneath us, the earth around and above, the earth pushing up against our houses, complicit with gravity, the earth ageless, watching us rise and curl, our spades, our oxen, the jagged lines we carve into dirt, the earth nicked and sliced into territory, hacked and hollowed, stoppered tight, tripwire, the earth ticking with mines, patient, biding its time, the earth floating in darkness, suspended in spin, the earth gunning it around the sun, the earth we ride in disbelief, the earth we plunder like thieves, the earth caked to mud in the belly of a village with no food, burying us, the earth coming off on our shoes. And, oh, thanks. And I'll read one of the last, is this the last poem? Almost the last poem in the book, the penultimate poem, When Your Small Form Tumbled Into Me. And the private joke I had with myself as I was writing this book is that I was pregnant for most of the writing of this book, and that was like the ultimate science fiction predicament as far as I was concerned, to have an alien life form growing inside of my own body. So this is a poem that kind of just dwells on that. It's called When Your Small Form Tumbled Into Me. So this is a poem written to my daughter when she was still in utero. I lay sprawled like a big game rug across the bed, belly down, legs wishbone wide. It was winter, work-a-day. Your father swung his feet to the floor. The kids upstairs dragged something back and forth on shrieking wheels. I was empty, blown through by whatever swells, swirling, and then breaks night after night upon that room. You must have watched for what felt like forever, wanting to be what we passed back and forth between us like fire, wanting weight, desiring desire, dying to descend into flesh, fault, the brief ecstasy of being. From what dream of world did you wriggle free? What soared and what grieved when you aimed your will at the yes of my body, alive like that, on the sheets? Thanks. So we can talk more if you have, well, I know you have questions. So I'm excited to hear them. If there are specific poems that you have questions about or want to hear, I'm open to that as well, and I'm happy to talk about the process of writing and revising any of the poems in the book.
Oh, you can stay over there. We're just gonna. Yeah.
Hi. Okay, so who's going to be first?
Right here. We're gonna go right here.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Nicole Bourgeois from St. Charles Catholic. I would like to know, in what way did the singer David Bowie inspire you to compose the poem Save Your Machine? And what is the significance of spelling your title different from his song?
I'm sure the title got spelled differently just because of like English. Does he have a U in Savior?
Yes, ma'am.
So it's just, you know, my editor said that's not how we spell it here. So it got corrected. Because I'm always confused about which words are supposed to have U's in them and which aren't. So I knew David Bowie's Life on Mars was a big inspiration for the themes of this book. And as I understand it, his song is thinking about life on Earth as well, and it's thinking about the sort of grotesque human spectacle as something that's terrifying and also kind of quaint and familiar and repellent, and that's how I always hear that song. And I knew that I wanted his vision of reality and of possibility to kind of prevail over the book, but I didn't think it was enough just to have the title stolen from his song, and so I thought maybe there are other ways that I can invoke him. So Savior Machine borrows a title from one of his poems. I always call his songs poems, but from one of his songs. And then, of course, there's a poem that invokes Bowie, which is Don't You Wonder Sometimes, which is another song of his song title. In Savior Machine, though, it's not David Bowie who's present. It's a poem about therapy. It's a poem about feeling freed to look at my life in a clear-eyed way. It's a poem about meeting my husband. So there's a he in the first part of the poem that is the therapist. 2 years later, I saw him walking up J Street into the sun. That happened. I was driving and I saw, oh, there's my old therapist walking home from the dry cleaners, it looks like, and thinking, how interesting that just regular small human man kind of helped me change my life in a way. And then there's a you that happens in the second half of the poem, which is addressed to my husband, who I think I was able to meet because I cleared up a lot of silly stuff through therapy. So it's really just a simple poem about, like being a human and asking for help from another human. I like when I was in graduate school, I read some Italian folk tales in a class, and one of them involved a young, a maiden who had been made mute by a witch who had just put some pebbles in her mouth, and she couldn't talk. She couldn't explain what was going on, and then someone helped her simply by just taking this pebble off of her tongue, and then she was herself again. And so that's what that final image in the poem is kind of, nodding toward, although I don't think you need to know that folktale, hopefully, to hear what's happening at the end of the poem.
Thank you.
Hey.
Hi, I'm Mitchell Dixon from Dutchtown.
Yeah.
In your poem, Life on Mars, you describe a few tragic events like harsh prison life and the girl that was locked up in the parents' basement. Where or what were these events inspired from?
Well, I was reading the newspaper, and those were the things that were in the news that again, I was pregnant for the first time, and I was thinking, what am I doing? Bringing another person into this world that is just crazy, where everything that we seem to get our hands on is hurt in some way, we being just humankind. And I was sort of upset by what I was reading, and I wanted to explore it a little bit. I wanted to call it out. I wanted to have to put myself, as much as language can make possible, into the uncomfortable position of being implicated and connected to, or even, affected by these awful events that were happening. I think that there are a few poems that are thinking about public history, and all of them come from that same place of thinking this is terrible, and yet because I'm alive and I'm a person, I'm somehow connected to this. And it's not enough to read it and say, oh, that's bad, and put the newspaper down and then go shopping. I wanted to have to sort of dwell in that ugliness. And so the poem, writing those sections of that poem that dwell on those events, helped me to do that, to say this isn't just fleeting.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Erin Robinson. I'm from Franklin High School, and I have two questions about your poem, They May Love All He Has Chosen. My first question is, with the reports that from New York Times, did you factor those in before you wrote part of the poem, or would you factor it afterwards?
Those were the reason I wrote the poem. Those events. I was reading, those events happened in about a 6-week time span, and those are just the things that the New York Times reported on. So imagine what else happened in the world. And I felt like this awful you know, the momentum of this of hate crimes, basically. They seem to be happening on a regular basis in places that were really close to home. And the poem comes from my anger at that, and it also struggles through anger into a different emotional or mental perspective. So that poem opens up with the language that comes very deliberately from like Jim Crow America. Trying to find it. So it says, you know, let them wait. Lead them to the back porch and let them lean there while the others eat. If they thirst, give them a bucket and a tin cup. If they're sick, tell them the doctor's away, that he doesn't treat their kind. I mean, that language comes directly from the ways that blacks were discriminated against during the Jim Crow era in this country. And my anger wanted me to turn that hateful perspective on the perpetrators of hate crimes. And then I said, a good poem can't come out of anger. I've got to modulate that. And so I moved sort of painfully out of that mode into different views of looking at this phenomenon of widespread killing. When I got to the fourth section, I had been consoling myself over the span of grieving for my dad by saying he's gone, but maybe he can still see me. Maybe he's still here somehow. And then I said, oh, if he's here, then he knows what a mess I am. He knows everything I've always tried to kind of keep him from knowing. And then I said, yeah, but he's not human in that way. He probably understands. He gets it. He probably has a compassionate view of me as a real person. And that was really consoling. And I said, but if it's true of him, maybe it's true of every single person who leaves this form, like life on earth. What if it's true of the victims of these awful, senseless crimes? And so that section of the poem came out of this really startling sort of like possibility. And it was very eerie to write a section of the poem in which these people are not angry, they're not even sullen, they're just living their lives with a kind of wonder and understanding. And that, to me, felt like a lesson that I was learning. I don't think it's about saying this isn't bad. I think it's about saying what would happen if we can get outside of the limitations of ordinary human feeling. What could we become?
Okay, and my second question was about the poem. Well, it was the letter that Johanna had written to her killer, Stephen. I think Stephen, how you want to say his name. Mm-hmm. But my question was, why did you quote the sonnet 30, the saddest poem? Why did you quote that in her letter?
I read that was her favorite poem. And I think it was read at her memorial service. And it's a beautiful poem. And the image of her as this young woman with so many, possibilities, and then the fictional version that I created of her in the afterlife, it seemed vast in a way that made sense.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Hi.
Hello, I'm Jamie L. from Southeastern. I had a question about your writing process. When do you get to the point where you know that what you have written is the poem that you want to go with? Like, do you feel that revision is a necessary part of the process?
Yeah. Revision is the biggest part of the process, I think. It's where I get to say, this is what I was able to do in the moment or even over time. And now I'm coming back with fresh energy and a different kind of objectivity to make it better and to take advantage of the opportunities that I missed or that I was too tired or impatient to explore when I was writing the poem. And it's also an opportunity to be honest and say, I'm bored here, it needs to go. Or I keep doing this thing over and over again from poem to poem. I need to stop that and do something else. So that's where I come back, and that's where the poems get pushed. And I think it's also where the thinking grows, because the first answer is usually not the best answer. And so saying, well, if that is plausible, what if I run a few more steps forward with that? Where will the poem be by then? And to get back to the first part of your question, I feel like I'm getting close to a finished draft when I start to feel that the poem is revealing things to me about the material that I hadn't thought of or noticed before. And it's kind of a sort of an intuitive thing where I say, I get this sort of jolt of excitement because I start seeing things differently. It's like maybe the lights have come on in the poem for me and I can make out different things with clarity. Then I think maybe an ending is in sight if I can get there. And so I say the thinking has changed. There's some sort of a realization that's happened. How can I cement that with imagery and the musical qualities of language? How can those things come together to support this discovery that the poem has suddenly had? And then that's where I go back and think about the sounds of words. I think about the verbs and nouns that I've used, if they've been pushed to the most interesting place, or if they're still stuck in the most literal place. And then I think, have I said too much? Is there anything that I can now go back and cut? A lot of the times for me, it means I get to go back and cut the last stanza that I wrote because I've written past something. I've spelled things out too much. And it allows me to go back and think about where the poem started as well, and see if it truly starts in the first line, or if I was writing my way into something that really starts 3 or 4 or 8 lines later. So all of that's exciting because it means that I've taken some of the original feelings and thoughts and I get to build upon them. The title is one of those places too. Maybe the title of the poem is working in a literal way, but if I change it, the poem can speak to more things more subtly, and so sometimes I'll change the title once the poem is finished as well.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hi.
First, I want to say, honored to have you here. I'd like to know, what is it that got you interested into writing in the first place? And for anyone who may be interested into creative writing or literature to express and share their own creativity, what advice would you have to get to them to get their feet off the ground?
I think that the advice that is most prevalent is the right advice, which is you have to read. I think that reading, I always say, look how slim a book of poems is. You could read one every day, a different one every day at breakfast. And if you do that, you're really feeding yourself. Like, that's a good start. Because you're going to be thinking, oh, this is what another person's imagination can do with the material. And you're also going to say, well, these are the sort of the poetic tools that this writer seems really good at using. Maybe these are tools that I can lift out of this poet's material and put in my own and see where it can go. I mean, that's my workshops at Princeton are rooted in reading published poems closely so that we can see all of the choices and the changes and the shifts that occur from beginning to end and what those things bring about, and then lift them out of the specifics of the poet's material and see what we can do with them in our own. And then I guess the other thing that I think is really important is to find a sense of community. It's hard to do this lonely work, and it's work that you don't get rewarded for most of the time. And so you've got to understand that it's valuable in some way. It's valuable to you for private reasons, and it means something to other people who are doing the same thing. And if you can find people who can invest in your writing and in whose writing you can invest, it becomes immediately joyful. And I think that's what kind of sustains a writing life. And I think it also makes you less selfish, because you're not just saying, I want this prize and this job for myself and this opportunity, but you're thinking, oh, that would be really good for this person that I care about. Or I want to share this opportunity with somebody else. And I think it makes you a better citizen.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi, so I'm Christine Lorette from Northlake Christian School, and you have such a close-to-home understanding of space and massive reach of this, but some of your poems reference an unknown pull to humanity or reason for our existence. I find this evident in the It and Company poem. Do you feel like some of these poems represent the unknown umbrella of God or of a greater being? If so, is this with purpose?
Yeah, I think the poems, I didn't realize that my poems were so theological, but they are. And I think one of the things that I came to understand about writing Life on Mars was that I was also looking for a version of God that I would be willing to entrust my parents to. I wanted something bigger than the, more complicated seeming than the human God, human emotioned God of the Old Testament that I always can't help but see with the long beard somehow, I guess from the Sistine Chapel. I wanted to make this sense of belief that I grew up with and that I still have suited to the scale of knowledge that we now, kind of are at, the sense that we can almost see how the universe began. And math seems to be this, like kingdom of meaning and wonder and order and logic, and so many things obey this large systematic set of principles. I wanted to build God to scale with that. And I guess, in a way, writing poems like It and Company or Cathedral Kitsch helped give me a vocabulary for that. And it's definitely something that kind of lives in my work. My new book is doing that in different terms. I think it's the natural world that seems to invoke a sense of the holy and the mysterious in my newer poems, but I think it's there. It's at the heart of a lot of the questions that I ask, and maybe this idea that I'm comfortable with an unknowable presence or mystery also shapes what I'm looking for in a poem too. I'm not looking to solve something completely, but to get as close as I can to what is unimaginable.
Thank you so much.
I have two questions which are connected to one another. One is how I love to draw parallels between artists, and since you are so inspired by Bowie, I see that you both take a glimpse into the future to sort of soothe anxiety about the present and the future and what you hope to become, in a sense that you hope to change it now. Do you find that is what helps you when you write, is to help soothe your anxieties about the future and hope somebody can sense that? Definitely.
And the somebody usually is me, because I don't want to presume that anybody else is going to bother. But the anxieties that I have when explored through the medium of poetry is comforting, because it allows me to find a different path through and to imagine that there are different possibilities that I could be hoping for.
I love that. And my second question is, in The Universe is a House Party, again, going back to looking towards a hopeful glimpse into the future, it seems a bit kaleidoscopic and whimsical. Is this what you hope will become, is that we sort of leave our restrictions and boundaries of now to become a boundless future?
In some ways, yeah. I have to look at the poem. I'm going to read that poem, if that's okay, because it makes it easier for me to talk about it. The universe is a house party. The universe is expanding. Look, postcards and panties, bottles with lipstick on the rim, orphan socks, and napkins dried into knots. Quickly, wordlessly, all of it whisked into file with radio waves from a generation ago, drifting to the edge of what doesn't end, like the air inside a balloon. Is it bright? Will our eyes crimp shut? Is it molten, atomic, a conflagration of suns? It sounds like the kind of party your neighbors forget to invite you to, bass throbbing through walls, and everyone thudding around drunk on the roof. We grind lenses to an impossible strength, point them toward the future, and dream of beings we'll welcome with indefatigable hospitality. How marvelous you've come. We won't flinch at the pinprick mouths, the nubbin limbs. We'll rise, gracile, robust, mi casa es su casa, never more sincere. Seeing us, they'll know exactly what we mean. Of course, it's ours. If it's anyone's, it's ours. I think there's a lot of playful stuff happening in this poem. Reading it now, I see these two regions, right? It's the opening, kind of a parade of all of these kind of trifling markers of our day-to-day life, panties, postcards, party, detritus. And then there's a moment, I think, whisked into file with radio waves from a generation ago where something larger attempts to come in. Like, is it history? All this junk, is it history? And if so, where is it going, and what will we see when we get there too? And then the poem gets a little bit light again, thinking about a party in a New York apartment building with people up there making noise and leaving you out, and then it goes back into the sense of wish. I think it was moving back and forth between those two tones, which I did kind of instinctively, that made me think, yeah, we're dealing with real people. I'm one of them, piddling little messy people who also have this enormous sense of wish for the future, or not even the future, just like what will we come to know. But when I got to this point in the poem where these alien people or beings enter, something else happened for me. So we go back to this sense of hospitality and a party, and someone saying, how marvelous you've come, welcoming them as though they're guests. And what I heard in that, how marvelous you've come, mi casa es su casa, make yourself at home, was this sense of propriety, the sense of territory. And I didn't know that was on my mind at the beginning of the poem, but the path that the poem charted helped me to see that one of the things that the poem wanted to speak to is our sense that everything we see belongs to us. How can that be, right? There's something so innately wrong about that. And I think I liked that discordant, sort of insistent and ugly tone, and allowed the poem to kind of end on that.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Dalen from Southeastern, and I really loved your poem. They may love all that he has chosen, and I was really struck by the title because to me it read a little bit like a Bible verse, and so I was just curious to know what was going through your head when you wrote the title of this poem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted something that felt like a proverb or something, and I found that passage that came from one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, so one of these like holy texts that had been lost or expunged from the Bible that we use for a long time, and it was interesting to me that hate was one of the words, like imagining that God wants us to hate something, and I know that what is being hated in that text is sinfulness and all of that, but it spoke to the sense of mission and purpose that I think guides some fanatics. I hate a group of people, and therefore I'm going to act on this belief. The wrongness of that seemed to clash in an effective way with a title that seems to be about choosing what is good and righteous. I wrote the poem first, and I had to go digging around looking for a title. But that poem is also attempting to give space to something that I don't really know how to describe. The last section of that poem says, line them up, and that them is the killers. Let us look them in the face. They are not as altogether ugly as we'd like. I think the thing that's so easy to do is to imagine that somebody who would commit a hate crime is inhuman. And part of the work of this poem is to gather up what is human and to look at it even-handedly. So the victims are looking at, you know, the world they've left or that they're now inhabiting differently in this even-handed, compassionate way. And so I felt like the charge of the poem was to attempt to do that, no matter how awful it feels with somebody. So, okay, there's a person who's obeying something that they believe is telling them the truth. And I think there's this awful feeling of terror that I get when I read the last lines, you know, empty of fear, buoyant with the thrill of such might, these murderers, they go. And I'm maybe just trying to make a space to look at a situation from a very uncomfortable perspective and to see what we're really looking at here.
Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Anna. I'm from Franklinton High School, and throughout your poems, there are a lot of really evident themes of brutality and of hate and of crime, as was just mentioned. But the one thing that kept coming back to me was something that was much more immaterial. It was existentialism. And I just kind of felt that there was a question throughout all of the poems in your book, is the human race here for something? And I was wondering if you yourself had a personal answer to that.
Can you ask the question again? It's hard for me to hear the speakers pointing that way. Is the human race what?
Do you think that the human race has an actual reason to be here?
I do. I mean, you wouldn't. I think it is. We're probably here to learn something. We're probably here to learn how to love each other, and it's a hard task, and we fail most of the time. But we have so many opportunities, and that's kind of what I am thinking now. I don't think I would have been able to say that when I was writing these poems. But I think that might be where I stand right now. We're here to struggle and suffer in an attempt to become larger and more loving beings.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm James from Dusttown, and my question is, you've said in multiple interviews that David Bowie is one of your main sources of inspiration. What entices you about David Bowie's music, and do you personally relate to any of them, any of his songs?
Do I personally relate to?
Any of his songs?
Oh, any of his songs, yeah. Well, I love David Bowie's sense of, well, I think he was a musical genius, somebody who transformed himself many times over the course of his career. And the era that I really feel most like connected to is his 70s glam rock era, which is when I was, you know, being born and growing up in the, you know, early part of my childhood. I love the sense of possibility. I love that even a kind of sense, there's something naive and beautiful about the sense of the future and space and love at the heart of his poems, songs. I love the freedom of all of his different personae. I remember really getting into that period of his career when I was in my early 30s and trying to invent myself and loving the ways that he did that. But I also love those songs. I think they're so, like his song 5 Years is one that maybe would be my favorite song, and it's about being told that the earth had 5 years left to live. The earth was dying, and it's this really poignant story about love and loss and, you know, the shame of what we're doing and the sense of what's at stake. And, you know, that was a song from 40 years ago, but it feels so useful to today. So I just love his voice. I love his imagination. And I used to have about twice a year, I would have a dream where I somehow was hanging out with David Bowie and we were wearing matching jumpsuits and singing together. So I figured I was probably never going to meet him and get to dress up with him, but maybe I could write some poems that were almost sitting beside the work of his that I've loved.
Thank you.
Hello. What is it that pulls you?
What is it that pulls me? That's a hard question. Sometimes, well, okay, I've been reading some Tibetan books about being, and I realized that, you know, in Buddhism, there's like a central path that you're urged to adopt that is down the middle, where you're not being pulled by the desire for gains and the fear of loss. You're not being motivated by the wish for fame or the fear of disgrace. You're not being motivated by the desire for pleasure or the, you know, distaste for pain. And then there's one other dual thing that I can't remember right now. I wish I were enlightened in that way, but I think that, like most people, I'm excited by all of the stuff in the left-hand column, you know, pleasure, gains, and, you know, like celebration. And I think that poetry allows me to sort of shift lanes and become somebody who's wiser and who's not looking for those immediate sensations, who's able to think, who wants to weigh choices, make the harder choice, do something where very little is at stake, but everything, perhaps like philosophically or spiritually, is at stake. So in my day-to-day life, I'm just, you know, motivated by things that people are motivated by when they're not thinking. And then when I get to be a poet, I get to become better and think about what might really sit at the center of our experience that's worth cleaving to and working or struggling to access.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks. Okay. Oh.
In your poem, It's Not, you challenge the idea that death is not an ending. Are you hoping, or do you actually believe that there's more after death?
Probably both. I mean, I grew up believing in, you know, God and an afterlife, and I've never really been interested in getting myself out of that mindset. It's like, I don't think I could. My parents did a good job of indoctrinating me. So I'm just starting from there. And then what gets added to that predisposition is the fact that I'm on this side of life and someone I love is on the other side. And I want to convince myself that what I believe is not only real, but that maybe his leaving is a departure towards something better. And so that's what that poem is for. And it's also for my sister, who was really also struggling with a sense of deep grief after our dad died. And so it's a poem that's kind of asking us both to say, but wait, this is what we feel like. Can we change our perspective and see it, you know, in this other way?
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
In your poem, Solstice, you mentioned the brevity of human life. Are you referring to the individual or the idea that there will come a time where humanity no longer exists?
Well, I don't know. There will come a time when we don't exist, but I think about the history of the earth, and it would probably be a safe bet that we will be an extinction and something else will come about. But that's not what I really want the poem to be about. You know, I kind of want the poem to be about us in our lives and figuring out how to not kill geese and not rig elections and not become smaller hearted and minded people. But I got locked into that. The Times is getting smaller day by day. The New York Times shrinks a little bit every year or so. And then I had to look at that diminishing in different ways because the form of the poem is a villanelle, and it means you have to keep repeating these certain lines. So I had to look at that line in different different and uncomfortable ways. Maybe the most hopeful way of taking that last line of the poem is to think that our time is brief. My generation's, or the generation that, you know, is kind of driving things right now, has only so much time left, and then your generation gets to come in and do what you guys are capable of doing, which seems like it might be a lot better. And in some ways, if I think about it that way, that's exciting to me.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Ashley from St. Charles. I have a question about like the soul. I got from I loved the poem, but like the overall theme I got was like the emphasis on like change and it being gradual. Can you elaborate more on that for me, please?
Yeah. I'll tell you one thing about that poem is when I first published it, it was part of Don't You Wonder Sometimes. It was like an additional section. And then the last poem in the book, Us and Company, was the last section of that poem. So it was a poem that had the David Bowie, and then it went to this sense of the soul. So if you go from David Bowie to a poem that begins, the voice has heft, then it's different. But when I looked at that poem again, I felt like there were too many parts to the poem, and it was sloppy, doing too many different things. But I liked those other sections, and I wanted to give them a new life. And so detaching it from the David Bowie poem and calling it The Soul gave me a new way of looking at one of the themes that runs through the book, which is the sense of the everlasting and the sense of life after life, or whatever you want to call it. Let's see if I can find that poem. What page is it on?
Around 23. I think it's 23. It's 23.
Yeah. And anyway, the poem moves away from, if it was about David Bowie in the beginning, by the end it's not, right? The body is what we lean toward, tensing as it darts, dancing away. But it's the voice that enters us. Okay, it's possible that this is still an audible voice, but then there's something else that happens. It's no longer audible, even saying nothing over and over absently to itself. Suddenly, the poem is thinking about a different kind of listening, which feels like when we're going inward. And I liked to anchor that feeling to the idea of the soul and see the poem change as a result.
So I would be correct in interpreting like the theme as like a change in like the overall soul and perspective of
I think that's
part of like the body and spirit.
Yeah, I think there's good evidence for that perspective on the poem.
All right, thank you.
Hi, I'm Aaliyah from Dutchtown, and I have one question. How do you believe your style of writing fits into Afrofuturism?
Can you repeat the question again?
How do you believe your style of writing fits into Afrofuturism?
I don't know. I hope it does, because I'm excited by this idea that a Black perspective, or the perspective of Blackness, is a driving force for reimagining possibilities in the future. I am Black, and I have a perspective that's rooted in many ways in that experience of Blackness. And this book of poems is thinking about the future, and it's using visibly recognizable tropes from like science fiction to do that. And so I think maybe that's one way of aligning myself with Afrofuturism. I didn't know what Afrofuturism as a term was when I was writing these poems. I didn't think that I was part of a group or a school or a camp or a movement. I was just using some questions and some, like images to sort some things out. But I do know that the kind of world-creating possibilities that live in science fiction were inspiring to me. So Octavia Butler was someone who I thought, I should write. I need, and maybe one day I will, write an elegy now for Octavia Butler. Isaac Asimov is a voice that isn't really like directly trackable, but one of his stories, The Last Question, kind of, if I could have written that, I wouldn't have needed to do these poems. So I like to believe that my work is aligned with that. I also like to believe that the work in my new book, which is thinking about the present by way of what we might go back and learn better from history, is also kind of an Afrofuturistic text because it's thinking about what progress might require of us. It's futuristic in the way that, if you remember from a couple of years ago, steampunk, which was like the steam engine aesthetic applied toward a kind of modern set of questions or design questions, is futuristic. So I'm grateful that my name gets included sometimes among the list of people who would be Afrofuturists.
All right, thank you.
Hello. After reading Cathedral Kitsch, I thought that you were questioning kind of the homage to God through materialism, and if the homage was for humans or really for God. So is that true? Is that what you meant?
I think so. That's a nice way of kind of framing that poem. It starts out with a kind of a tongue-in-cheek question, does God love gold? And then it ends with this image. It took me years to figure out how to end the poem, that final like 2.5 lines, but of, what is deeply human? Somebody who's dragging a bag of crushed cans down the street in a city out of need. And, both the wish to make, a giant cathedral and to just persist, they seem so elementally human, and somehow, I don't know, the discontinuity between those two modes felt urgent, like to think that maybe looking at the cans in the street is a different route to God from looking at the, great stained glass and the beautiful gold pipes and things like that.
Thank you.
How are we doing with time? We're good? Okay. Thank you.